Preston Wexler laughed out loud when Caleb Vale raised his paddle for Aurelius Venator number 156. In front of billionaires and photographers, the CEO mocked the worn jacket, the scuffed boots, and the old pickup truck parked outside. He announced that a single father had no business dreaming about a car worth tens of millions of dollars. Caleb said nothing. He simply set a locked case on the registration table. When the auctioneer opened the folder inside, the room went silent, because all 155 other registration titles carried the exact same name. If you enjoy watching arrogance meet its match, hit subscribe and stay until the very end of this story. Caleb Vale drove his old Ford pickup into the Monterey auction grounds, where a line of Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and Ferraris idled along the entrance. He wore a charcoal jacket softened by years of use, no watch worth mentioning, and carried nothing but a locked leather case. Before stepping out, his phone buzzed with a call from his daughter Mallory, who asked whether today he would finally bring home the last member of the Aurelius family. Caleb told her he couldn't promise anything, only that he had prepared carefully and would let the process decide the outcome on its own terms. The short conversation revealed pieces of who Caleb was without ever stating them outright. He had raised Mallory alone since his wife passed away years earlier, and the old truck they were discussing had carried more meaning than any luxury vehicle ever could. Mallory knew about her father's quiet preservation project, though she had never been part of the bidding itself, and she simply wished him luck before hanging up. Caleb tucked the phone away and walked toward the registration tent with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. 20 years earlier, Caleb had been a young test engineer at Aurelius Motor Works, the kind of employee who stayed late tightening suspension bolts long after the executives had gone home for the evening. He had helped calibrate the very prototype now sitting under the auction canopy, running it through endurance laps until his hands smelled permanently of brake fluid and hot metal. When the company folded under a wave of debt and mismanagement, Caleb watched engineers twice his age lose their pensions overnight, and he carried that memory with him into every decision he made afterward. He never forgot how quickly a legacy built by hundreds of skilled hands could be reduced to scrap value in a bankruptcy filing. After Aurelius closed, Caleb spent nearly a decade working quietly in automotive diagnostics before founding Vale Dynamics, a company built around a thermal management system he had designed to keep high-performance batteries from degrading under repeated racing loads. The technology found its way into everything from electric delivery fleets to professional racing teams, and within a few years, larger manufacturers were lining up to license it. When Caleb eventually sold the majority of his stake, the payout was substantial enough to change his family's life completely. Yet he never bought a mansion, never chartered a private jet, and never once let the money alter how he dressed or how he carried himself. Instead, he began making phone calls, tracking down old contacts from his Aurelius days, and asking a single question that would define the next 9 years of his life. Where had all the surviving Venators gone? Inside, his attorney, Naomi Sloan, met him near the credential desk and confirmed that every piece of paperwork had cleared. The escrow deposits had been wired, the bank had verified his liquidity, and all 155 ownership certificates had been notarized and indexed for the day's proceedings. Northline Automotive Heritage Trust, the quiet foundation behind the filings, satisfied the collection integrity threshold laid out in the founder's estate. Caleb asked her to keep his ownership stake private unless the situation truly required it, preferring to let the numbers speak only when necessary. Across the lot, a member of Preston Wexler's staff photographed the dented pickup truck and sent the image straight to his boss. Preston recognized the man standing beside it immediately, recalling a junior engineer he had once brushed past years earlier, and the memory made him grin. He just did it right there. that he would keep Caleb in the room long enough to turn him into entertainment for the reporters he had personally invited. It never occurred to him to ask what exactly Caleb had been doing for the past 9 years. Preston had built his entire public identity around the idea that success could be measured in visible signals, watches, tailored suits, and the make of car parked outside a building. He rarely paused to consider that some of the wealthiest people he had ever met carried none of those signals at all, preferring instead to let their bank statements and legal filings do the talking when it actually mattered. That blind spot had served him poorly more than once in his career, though he had always managed to talk his way past the consequences before they caught up with him. This time, standing in a room full of people he had invited specifically to witness his own performance, there would be no talking his way past anything. At center stage sat Aurelius Venator 156, its carbon fiber body catching the light beneath a canopy built specifically for the unveiling. The car wore a midnight graphite finish that had never appeared on any production Venator, and its naturally aspirated engine remained untouched by the turbocharging trends that had swallowed the rest of the industry. Yet its value never rested solely on horsepower or paint. This was the very prototype Warren Aurelius himself approved before the company's collapse, the test vehicle used to validate the suspension geometry that defined the entire line. The car carried the signatures of all 38 engineers who built it, etched quietly along the underside of the dashboard where no showroom visitor would ever think to look. Owning it meant completing something larger than a single purchase. It meant holding the final piece required to certify a full Venator collection, along with the rights to stage an exhibition called The Complete Aurelius Legacy. Preston wanted the car purely for spectacle, having already sold sponsorship rights to a watchmaking conglomerate eager to be photographed beside it during his new Supercar brand's global launch. Caleb wanted it for reasons that reached back further than any marketing calendar. As a young engineer, he had personally logged testing hours behind the wheel of this exact prototype, and on the day Aurelius Motorworks shut its doors, he made a private promise to Warren that the surviving cars would never be stripped for parts, modified into rolling advertisements, or scattered without care. In the 9 years since selling most of his stake in Veil Dynamics, the diagnostics company he built after the collapse, Caleb had quietly tracked down one Venator after another, pulling them out of forgotten warehouses, private estates, and even a few royal garages. Northline Trust now held clear title to Venators numbered 1 through 155, though almost nobody outside a small circle knew who actually controlled the foundation. The public simply understood it as a discreet preservation fund, with a habit of acquiring rare automobiles and quietly restoring them. Preston looked at the lone prototype on stage and believed that whoever won it would control what remained of the Aurelius legacy. Caleb understood the truth was the opposite. A single car, however historic, could never command the fate of 155 others already gathered under one roof. Warren Aurelius had written the collection integrity clause into his estate for a reason that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with protecting his life's work from exactly the kind of buyer Preston represented. In the years before his death, Warren had watched other automotive legacies get carved apart by conglomerates that cared only about licensing a badge for profit, stripping factories, and scattering historic vehicles into anonymous private garages where nobody would ever see them again. He wanted the Venator line to stay whole, or as whole as circumstances allowed, and he trusted his estate's lawyers to build a clause strong enough to survive decades of ownership changes. Few people in the industry ever expected the clause to matter, since nobody imagined a single collector could realistically gather 4 out of every 5 surviving examples of a car that had scattered across 3 continents. Caleb had read that clause the same week Aurelius declared bankruptcy, long before he had the resources to act on it, and it had stayed lodged in the back of his mind for years afterward. Every acquisition Northline made was measured against that 80% threshold, a quiet scoreboard only Caleb, Naomi, and a handful of trustees ever tracked. By the time the final scattered Venators surfaced at smaller regional auctions and private estate sales, Caleb no longer needed to negotiate aggressively. Sellers increasingly came to him first, aware that Northline paid fairly and treated every car with the kind of care a museum might offer. The last true holdout had always been Venator 156, since Warren's estate had specifically withheld it from public sale until the terms of his will could be executed at a formal auction. Preston crossed the floor with Grant Holloway trailing behind him, along with a cluster of advisors and reporters he had hand-picked for maximum visibility. He approached Caleb with a false warmth, asking whether he still fixed cars for a living, and Caleb answered simply that he still worked with ownables in one form or another. Preston studied the worn jacket for a long beat before delivering his first jab, remarking that working near supercars was not the same thing as being able to own one. Grant laughed loudly and asked if Caleb had confused a 9-figure auction with a technician job fair. Preston gestured toward the pickup truck, visible through the entrance, and announced, loud enough for the cameras to catch it, that a single set of Aurelius wheels probably cost more than the entire vehicle parked outside. Caleb did not flinch, and his silence only seemed to provoke Preston further, as though the absence of a reaction were itself an insult. When Naomi stepped closer, Preston assumed she was some kind of temporary assistant Caleb had hired for the day, and he asked whether she had properly explained that deposits could be forfeited if a bidder failed to demonstrate real financial standing. Naomi calmly confirmed that her client had already cleared every stage of financial vetting required by the house. Preston kept talking anyway, pitching his voice for the press pool behind him, and said that being allowed into the room hardly guaranteed being allowed to leave it with the car. He turned to one of the photographers he had personally invited and suggested, only half joking, that they capture a photograph of Caleb standing beside the prototype for what he called a memory to take home, since it would likely be the closest he ever got to owning one. Grant chimed in with a story meant to entertain the small crowd gathering near the stage, claiming he'd once seen a shop mechanic try to sell a client a windshield wiper blade for triple its retail price, and asking Caleb, with mock sincerity, whether that kind of markup was standard practice in his line of work. A few of Preston's guests laughed nervously, unsure whether the joke was meant to be cruel or simply awkward, but nobody stepped in to redirect the conversation. Caleb let the laughter pass without a reaction, his eyes drifting instead toward the prototype on stage, studying the familiar lines of a car he had once helped bring to life. Naomi noticed the shift in his attention and quietly reminded him that the credentialing officer needed his signature before the floor opened, giving him a graceful reason to step away from Preston's audience. Vivian Sterling, the auction house's chairwoman, called the floor to order and reminded everyone of the collection integrity clause buried in the fine print of the catalog. Grant skimmed the page and dismissed it out loud, insisting that no single buyer could possibly control 80% of the surviving Venators. Caleb heard the remark clearly but chose not to correct it. Preston declared to everyone within earshot that he intended to win the car at any price, and that he wanted Caleb to keep raising his paddle so he could later understand the gap between an unemployed engineer and an automotive empire. Conrad Ashbourne, chairman of the Wexler Crown Board, warned Preston quietly that he was approaching the ceiling the board had authorized for this acquisition. Preston brushed the warning aside, insisting that brand perception was worth more than a few extra $1 million. Vivian opened the bidding at $8 million, and Caleb raised his paddle first without hesitation. Preston immediately countered at $10 million, barely glancing at his own advisors before doing so, determined to set the tone early. A handful of international collectors joined briefly, pushing the number to 13 million, and Caleb answered calmly at 13.5. Preston kept escalating in large jumps meant to project dominance rather than genuine interest in the increments themselves, moving the price to 15 million, then watching another bidder push to 15.5 before Caleb steadied it at 16. A collector from overseas, representing a private museum trust, tried once more at 17 million, clearly hoping the two men trading blows might tire before the number climbed out of reach. Preston barely let the bid register before topping it, determined to remind the room who was truly in control of the room's rhythm. Vivian tracked the pace carefully, calling each number with the same even tone regardless of how loudly Preston tried to punctuate his own bids, refusing to let the theater of the moment influence the formality of the process. Caleb, for his part, never raised his voice or his paddle a fraction of a second too early, content to let Preston exhaust himself performing for an audience that had started to grow quieter with every passing exchange. Each time Caleb lifted his paddle, Preston turned to look at him with the same thin, contemptuous smile, as if daring him to keep going. At 18 million, Preston loudly asked whether Caleb was spending his daughter's college fund, a remark that drew uncomfortable silence from several rows near the front. Caleb answered only that Preston should keep his attention on the car and not on his family, and the calm delivery seemed to irritate Preston more than any counterattack could have. He pushed the price to 20 million almost immediately afterward, as though trying to bury the moment under momentum. Naomi quietly reminded Caleb of their strategic threshold, aware that winning this single prototype would dramatically increase the value of the full collection regardless of who technically raised their paddle last. Caleb understood that better than anyone in the room, yet he also knew that emotion could not be allowed to override the plan they had built over 9 patient years. He thought briefly of the warehouse outside town where the earliest cars in the collection had once sat under tarps, engines seized from years of neglect, waiting for someone patient enough to bring them back to life one component at a time. Every dollar Preston threw across the room only reinforced how far that quiet warehouse project had traveled since those first difficult years, and Caleb found a strange kind of peace in watching the number climb, knowing exactly where it would eventually land. He also understood something Preston never considered, that the ceremony of the auction mattered less than the paperwork waiting beneath it. Public spectacles like this one existed to generate headlines and sell tickets, but the actual transfer of ownership always came down to signatures, verified funds, and the fine print nobody in the room besides Naomi and Vivian had bothered to read carefully. Caleb had spent 9 years building a case file thick enough to survive any challenge a rival might raise, and he trusted that preparation more than he trusted the noise currently filling the auction hall. Preston had no idea Caleb was weighing the value of an entire fleet rather than one car. He assumed his rival was simply chasing a single trophy far beyond his means. Grant informed the reporters that Wexler Crown had already arranged overnight transport for the vehicle, confident the outcome was settled. Vivian reminded the room once more that the hammer would not fall until the verification step tied to the special ownership clause had been completed. Preston waved the reminder off as routine paperwork, certain that no rival buyer could meet the 80% threshold. The price climbed past $22 million, and one by one the remaining international collectors quietly withdrew from the bidding, sensing the contest had narrowed to something more personal than financial. Soon only Caleb and Preston remained, trading numbers across a room that had gone almost completely silent apart from their voices. Caleb answered at 24 million, and Preston, without pausing, jumped straight to 28 million, declaring he wanted to teach the single father a lesson he wouldn't forget. Vivian paused for a moment to confirm the figure before turning back toward Caleb, who raised his paddle again at $28.5 million without a trace of hesitation. Preston didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to turn toward the cameras and ask Caleb, loudly enough for every microphone to catch it, whether he understood that the winning bidder had only 24 hours to complete payment. Caleb confirmed that he understood perfectly well. Preston offered, almost as a mock kindness, to give Caleb a job in the maintenance department if he would simply learn to accept what he called his real place in the world. The room grew tense in a way that had nothing to do with the escalating price. The mockery had crossed from ordinary competitive theater into something closer to public humiliation. Still, Caleb revealed nothing about who he really was. Instead, he asked Preston a quiet question that cut through the noise. Did he want the car because he understood it, or because he wanted people to watch him own it? Preston answered that in business nobody cared how much a car was loved, only who had enough money to put their name on it, and he pushed the bid to $30 million. Naomi glanced at Caleb, aware that under their strategy he could keep going, but that the estate's matching clause would ultimately let him secure the car at whatever final price Preston set, provided he could prove his ownership stake. Caleb raised once more to $30.5 million, testing exactly how far Preston's pride was willing to stretch. Conrad signaled urgently for Preston to stop, since the number had already blown past what the board had approved that morning. Preston ignored him completely, convinced that backing down in front of a man in a worn jacket would damage his reputation more than any budget overrun ever could. He pushed the bid to $33 million, his voice sharp with certainty that the contest was effectively over. Vivian asked Caleb if he intended to continue, and after a long pause, Caleb slowly lowered his paddle, watching the number settle into the record. Preston stood, accepting applause from his own staff, while Grant immediately began drafting a press release announcing that Wexler Crown had secured the final Aurelius prototype for its upcoming brand launch. Preston walked over to Caleb, unable to resist one last remark, and told him he had just paid $500 in registration fees to learn that men like him could never compete with men like Preston. Caleb only replied that the auction wasn't finished yet. Vivian, instead of calling for the final hammer, asked for the representative of the party who met the collection's eligible ownership threshold to step forward and present verification. Preston assumed this was simply procedural theater, a formality designed to keep the paperwork tidy before the sale was formally closed in his favor. Conrad turned to Grant and asked pointedly whether anyone on the marketing team had ever actually investigated the beneficial ownership behind Northline Automotive Heritage Trust. Grant insisted the probability of a single buyer controlling 80% of the surviving Venators was effectively zero, based on registration data his team had purchased from several state agencies. According to that data, ownership appeared scattered across a maze of museums, private trusts in Nevada, Delaware, and Wyoming, and cars that hadn't surfaced publicly in years. Nobody on Preston's team had bothered tracing those shell structures back to their ultimate controlling party. Naomi placed Caleb's locked case on the verification table and handed Vivian a security code, notarized bank statements, and a full ledger of chassis numbers cross-referenced against ownership filings. Preston kept talking through the process, insisting that maintenance receipts, service invoices, or photographs standing next to a supercar didn't turn a mechanic into a collector. Caleb calmly asked Preston whether he had ever actually looked closely at the emblem stitched into the corner of every Northline document. Preston answered dismissively that Northline was nothing more than a modest little foundation that dabbled in restoring old cars. Naomi explained that Northline avoided publicizing its asset value precisely because most of its vehicles remained under long-term preservation, occasionally loaned to museums, and often transported under the names of smaller holding companies to protect them from theft and speculation. Vivian instructed the main display screen to populate with the verified registry of every surviving Aurelius Venator, and the room watched as line after line began appearing. Venator number 1 traced back to Northline Heritage 1 LLC, and Venator number 2 carried the identical filing. Venator number 3 belonged to Vale Preservation Holdings, followed by Venator number 4 under Northline Competition Trust, and the list simply kept unspooling. The screen scrolled slowly, deliberately, as though Vivian wanted every person in the room to absorb the weight of what they were witnessing rather than rushing past it. Reporters who had arrived expecting a quick photograph of Preston celebrating his purchase now found themselves recording something entirely different. Phones angled toward the growing wall of names that all led back to the same quiet trust. Somewhere around the 40th entry, a murmur started building near the back rows, spreading forward until even Preston's own advisors had stopped whispering to each other and simply watched. Grant's earlier confidence had visibly drained from his face, replaced by the particular stillness of a man realizing his research had missed the only detail that actually mattered. Preston still assumed Caleb's connection extended to only a handful of vehicles buried somewhere in that growing list. Then, Naomi presented a consolidated filing showing that every single one of those holding entities, no matter how differently named, ultimately reported up to Northline Automotive Heritage Trust as their controlling parent. Vivian asked the room, plainly and without theatrics, who served as founder, principal beneficiary, and controlling voting authority for that trust. Naomi turned toward Caleb, and the entire room seemed to understand, in that single motion, exactly what was about to be confirmed out loud. Caleb rose from his seat without any theatrical flourish and confirmed that he was the founder and controlling beneficial owner of Northline Automotive Heritage Trust. The screen behind him filled with all 155 chassis numbers, each one tracing back through its holding company to the same controlling name. What had looked moments earlier like a scattered patchwork of unrelated owners resolved instead into a single unbroken structure. At the bottom of the display, a final line appeared in plain block letters identifying the beneficial controlling owner as Caleb Vale, and the room fell into a silence heavier than anything the bidding itself had produced. Preston demanded a recount, insisting it simply wasn't possible for one person to have quietly acquired 155 Venators without the industry noticing. Naomi walked the room through 9 years of patient acquisition, explaining that 41 cars had been purchased directly during the chaos of the original bankruptcy. 26 more had been traded for equity stakes inside the trust itself, and 38 had been bought back individually from private collectors, willing to sell quietly. 17 additional vehicles had been recovered from accident damage or years of warehouse neglect and painstakingly restored, while the remainder came through a series of confidential but entirely lawful transactions. Every one of the 155 cars carried a verified title, an import record, and a documented chassis history that matched the registry now glowing on the screen. Caleb hadn't stumbled into sudden wealth overnight. He had funded the effort methodically using proceeds from selling most of his stake in Vale Dynamics, asset-backed financing, and a small circle of preservation-minded partners who believed in what he was building. Vivian confirmed that Northline controlled well over 99% of all surviving Aurelius Venators, far beyond the 80% threshold specified in Warren Aurelius's original estate documents. Under those same documents, Caleb held the right to match the highest bid recorded that day, which stood at $33 million. Preston objected immediately, insisting that he, not Caleb, had been the one to set that price through his own bidding. Vivian explained the mechanism plainly, telling Preston that he had indeed established the price, but that Caleb retained the contractual right to match it and take priority as the qualifying collector. Preston turned toward Caleb, and something in his expression shifted as he finally understood that every escalation he had made to humiliate his rival had only handed Caleb a higher number to match. While simultaneously increasing the value of the very collection Preston had spent the day mocking. Naomi produced a confirmed escrow statement showing that $33 million already sat waiting in a verified account, ready for immediate transfer. Caleb formally matched the bid. Vivian asked one final time whether any party wished to raise a legitimate legal objection before the sale was closed, and the room offered nothing but silence. The gavel came down, and Vivian announced that Aurelius Venator 156 now belonged to Caleb Vale and Northline Automotive Heritage Trust. Preston stood frozen in front of the same reporters he had personally invited to witness what he assumed would be his moment of triumph. Caleb looked at him and said quietly that Preston had believed he'd come there to buy a single supercar, when in truth he had come to bring the last piece home to the 155 cars already waiting for it. Conrad pulled Preston aside within minutes and asked, in front of two other board members, why he had pushed the company's bid more than $10 million past the authorized ceiling to compete for an asset that, unbeknownst to him, already belonged to someone else in every meaningful sense. Grant tried to shift blame onto the research team, but Preston had personally instructed them to stop digging into Caleb's background, dismissing him as unworthy of the effort. Conrad announced that Preston would be suspended from operational authority pending a full internal audit of the acquisition process. Other board members, silent throughout most of the confrontation, began raising concerns of their own once Conrad opened the floor, pointing out that Preston had also committed marketing dollars to a sponsorship campaign built entirely around a car the company never legally controlled. One board member asked how the watchmaking partner, who had already paid a substantial fee for exclusive placement rights, would react once news of the failed acquisition became public. Nobody in the room had a comfortable answer, and the silence that followed made clear just how deep the damage from a single afternoon of bruised pride was likely to run. Preston, still unwilling to accept the loss, sought Caleb out afterward and offered $40 million to buy the prototype back on the spot. Caleb declined without hesitation. Preston raised the offer to $50 million and then proposed purchasing the entire Northline Trust outright, cars and all. When Caleb still refused, Preston tried a different approach, suggesting a partnership instead, one where Wexler Crown would fund the preservation efforts in exchange for exclusive media rights to the collection. He framed it as generosity, insisting that Northline's mission would reach a far wider audience under his company's marketing machine than it ever could operating quietly on its own. Caleb listened politely to the entire pitch before pointing out that the same machine had, only weeks earlier, planned to strip a historic prototype down to a photo backdrop for a watch campaign, and he saw no reason to believe the underlying instincts driving that plan had changed. Caleb asked him plainly what he intended to do with 156 vehicles once he owned them. Preston answered that he would sell off a portion, modify several for advertising campaigns, and retain only the most marketable examples for the Wexler Crown brand, a response that confirmed everything Caleb had suspected about his intentions from the very beginning. Caleb explained that Northline existed to preserve these cars, to honor the engineers who built them, and to fund a training center for the next generation of automotive talent, not to feed another marketing campaign. Preston scoffed, calling the whole vision sentimental and impractical for a man with real financial sense. Caleb answered evenly that Preston had more money than any person could reasonably spend in a lifetime, Yet he still couldn't understand why certain things were never built to be resold. Reporters captured the moment Preston walked out of the venue alone, no entourage trailing behind him the way it had when he first arrived. A supplemental filing surfaced days later, showing that the very supercar brand Preston had planned to launch depended on licensed use of original Aurelius design elements, rights that now also belonged entirely to Northline Trust. In the weeks following the auction, business publications ran extensive profiles trying to piece together how a former test engineer had assembled the largest privately held automotive collection in the country without a single leak reaching the press over 9 years. Some reporters framed it as a story about patience, others as a cautionary tale about underestimating quiet people. But Caleb declined most interview requests, preferring to let the Heritage Center's eventual opening speak for itself rather than turning his own story into another spectacle. The few interviews he did grant focused almost entirely on preservation and education rather than his personal finances, a choice that frustrated outlets hoping for a dramatic rags-to-riches narrative they could package neatly for their audiences. The public learned that Northline's holdings extended far beyond the physical cars themselves. During the original bankruptcy proceedings, Caleb had also lawfully acquired the original engineering blueprints, thousands of hours of archived testing data, the rights to stage the complete collection exhibition, and permission to use the Aurelius name for preservation and educational purposes. Preston had assumed that owning Venator 156 alone would let him borrow the Aurelius legacy for his own marketing purposes. In reality, he still needed Caleb's authorization for any of it, a fact his legal team confirmed only after the deal had already collapsed around him. Caleb never used that leverage to bury Wexler Crown. He declined to license a campaign he considered dishonest, but left the door open to transparent technical collaboration somewhere down the road. The internal audit at Wexler Crown ultimately found that Preston had spent company resources defending his own ego rather than the company's interests, and the board forced his resignation as chief executive. Grant lost his position as well, cited for submitting careless research and helping orchestrate a media spectacle that backfired in front of the very journalists he had recruited. He attempted, in his exit meeting, to argue that no reasonable marketing executive could have predicted a single collector quietly assembling 99% of a defunct manufacturer's surviving output. But the board pointed out that reasonable due diligence had never actually been attempted in the first place. His severance package included a confidentiality clause that prevented him from discussing the internal deliberations publicly, a detail that did little to stop industry insiders from piecing the story together anyway through court filings and Preston's own social circle. Conrad chose not to gut the company or lay off thousands of employees over one executive's mistake. Instead, he restructured the leadership team and personally delivered a formal apology to Caleb. Caleb accepted it without asking for further compensation, since reclaiming the last Venator mattered more to him than dragging out a prolonged legal fight. Once the full collection was assembled and verified, independent appraisers valued it at nearly 3 times what Northline had spent acquiring it, yet Caleb refused every offer to sell so much as a single car. Instead, he announced plans to build the Aurelius Heritage Center, a permanent home where all 156 vehicles would rotate through public exhibition rather than sit hidden behind warehouse doors. 1 year later, the center opened inside a restored factory building not far from where the original Aurelius plant once stood. Beyond the vehicles themselves, the site included a working restoration shop, an archive of original design documents, a technical training program for aspiring engineers, and a scholarship fund aimed at students pursuing careers in mechanical design. A quiet memorial wall honored the 38 engineers who had originally built the Venator line and a short test track allowed visiting students to experience the cars firsthand under close supervision. Caleb had insisted the memorial wall include not just names and titles, but small personal details submitted by surviving family members, so that visitors would understand these cars had been built by real people rather than an abstract corporate brand. Several retired engineers attended the opening in person, some of them meeting each other for the first time in nearly 2 decades, trading stories about testing mishaps and late nights in the old factory that none of them had spoken about in years. Caleb made a point of greeting each one personally, thanking them individually rather than folding their contributions into a generic speech, a gesture several of the older visitors admitted moved them more than any plaque ever could. The scholarship fund launched alongside the center's opening had already accepted its first class of students by the time the doors opened to the public. Young engineers selected not for their family connections or financial backgrounds, but for demonstrated skill and genuine curiosity about mechanical design. Caleb reviewed the applications personally alongside a small committee of former Aurelius staff, remembering clearly what it had felt like to be a young engineer without the resources or connections that so often decided who got a chance in the industry. He wanted the fund to open doors the way nobody had opened one for him at the very beginning of his own career, before Aurelius took a chance on an unproven kid with strong hands and sharper instincts than his resume suggested. Venator 156 sat at the center of the main hall, surrounded by the 155 cars that had waited 9 years for its return. Caleb arranged them not by market value but by production order, so that each car told its own chapter in the story of the company that built it. Mallory made a brief appearance at the opening, having contributed to the exhibition's layout design, though her father made clear she would earn her position through her own coursework and skill rather than through family connection. She had spent months studying industrial design at school, and the lighting arrangement guiding visitors through the timeline of chassis numbers had come largely from her own sketches, refined through several rounds of feedback from the same retired engineers now walking the halls beside her. When a visitor complimented the layout, Mallory redirected credit toward the design faculty who had mentored her, unwilling to let her father's name carry weight that belonged to her own effort. Caleb watched the exchange from a short distance away, quietly proud that she seemed to understand, even at 19, the same principle that had guided nearly every decision he'd made since selling Veil Dynamics. A reporter at the event asked Caleb why the owner of the world's only complete supercar collection still arrived in an old pickup truck. Caleb explained that the truck had belonged to him and his late wife since Mallory was small, and that it had once towed the earliest damaged Venators back to the workshop during the years before Northline could afford proper transport equipment. The old pickup wasn't a symbol of hardship. It was proof of the distance he had traveled to get here. When the reporter asked how it felt to be mocked so openly during the auction, Caleb answered that he never needed to convince Preston he deserved to own an Aurelius, because the paperwork behind 155 other cars had already made that argument for him. Caleb didn't hang his old auction paddle in some private office. Instead, he placed it inside the exhibit dedicated to Venator 156, beside a screen quietly cycling through the full history of the collection for any visitor curious enough to stop and read it. As the event wound down, Caleb climbed back into his weathered pickup and drove away from the center, while all 156 Aurelius Venators rested safely behind glass, exactly where he had always intended them to be. Long after the reporters packed up their equipment and the last visitors filtered out of the main hall, Caleb walked one final lap through the exhibition alone, pausing beside each car the way he once had during his earliest days as a young engineer running late-night diagnostics in an empty factory. He stopped longest beside Venator 156, running a hand lightly along the fender the way a person might greet an old friend they hadn't seen in years. The car had waited a long time to come home, and so, in its own way, had he. Outside, the evening air carried the faint smell of cut grass and warm asphalt, the same ordinary smell that had followed him through every stage of his life, long before anyone thought to call him a collector, or count the cars parked behind the glass walls of a museum he had built quietly, one careful year at a time, with nothing but his own patience. Preston Wexler had walked into that auction house believing he could buy anything he wanted, but Caleb Vale had walked in to prove that some things only ever belong to the person who understands what they're truly worth.